Welcome to the Halacha podcast Leman Yishmu with Harav Yosef Yeshaya Braun, Mara Asra, and a member of the Crown Heights Beis Din. This podcast is brought to you by the Ask the Rav platform in partnership with Leman Yilmedu, the premier institute for practical halacha learning.
Welcome to our next exciting Leman Yishmu Ask the Rav podcast. I want to point out that in response to people who have asked about the podcasts, on our website, asktherav.com, you can see a lot of the references. So here we discuss the give and take, the back and forth, the reasons for, reasons against. But if you want to look up the sources, a lot of the sources and references are addressed at length on our website for each podcast. Which brings me to the first question that many people have been asking about this whole idea of using technology for halacha. In the past, people would ask Shailos to a Rav in person. Today's day and age, it's a time of technology. People use, of course, the phone, but people also use text messages, email, and other different forms of technology instead of face-to-face contact. Is that a good thing or not? So, truth to be told, there's a lot of positives in these new methods of communication. Of course, we might be missing the personal element. Talking to a Rav in person is nothing like that. And very often you talk on the phone, you have no idea who you're talking to. And it's really important to know who we're talking to. In halacha, we often find there's a difference if it's Hefsek merubah, if it's a great loss. So the person's financial situation makes a big difference. And if you have no idea who you're talking to and you don't know their economic circumstances, you might give a different answer. It also depends who you're talking to in terms of what's their level in Yiddishkeit and Avodas Hashem. So you have a concept of a Baal Nefesh Yachmer, someone who's extra machmer because of his spiritual, higher, elevated standing. And then you have a person who's starting to, step by step, their steps in Yiddishkeit, they're taking slow steps, and they might not be room to impose a particular chumrah. We need to know exactly the person that we're talking to. Does he suffer from particular ailments? Does he have mental issues? Does he have OCD? All these things could have particular bearing on the psak, and there might also be a particular difference where he lives, because there's different minhagim, different customs based on the place, and those customs are sometimes binding according to halacha. He might live in a place where there's a Mara Asra, and that Rav has a particular psak, and therefore that's the appropriate psak where he lives. So it's important to take all of this into account, but yet I will say there's a major advantage in some of the new methods of technology over the phone system. In the past, poskim have spoken about against the idea that people are starting to ask Shailos via the phone. When it became a normal thing for people to call up Rabbanim via the phone, a lot of Rabbanim lamented the fact that they don't have any more that original style of contact. But the new methods of communication, which involve a written response via text, email, websites, etc., has one advantage that is very similar to the old style, because people in olden days, besides for talking to a Rav in person, would write letters to a Rav. Most of our Shailos and most of our responses, these are letters that were written in response to questions. Very often they're questions from great Rabbanim, but sometimes they're questions from lay people who asked Shailos, and they got a psak b'ksav. One of the advantages of getting a written psak is that the person who writing thinks much more when they write. It's very different when you write than when you speak. When you're speaking, there's writing, there's printing, and then there's publishing. And daven shabbat, we know when something is published, it's l'doida doidus. It's for generations. So when someone commits something to writing or to print or puts something on a website, he's much more careful about what he writes. But also from the person who's reading it, when you're listening to someone, you heard what they said and you've gone and you might not even remember the details. When you have it in writing, you could review it again and again and again. Often, when a Rav gets a phone call, it's very hard for him afterwards to contact the person who asked the question. If he realizes that he found out new information, he might have misunderstood the question. But when it's in writing in an email, there's always a chance to go back and forth via the email. Now, it is possible to call back a person, but practically speaking, based on the volume of calls that Rabbanim get, it's very hard to follow up in terms of the phone calls. You know, which phone call was which person for which shaila. Whereas when everything is in writing, there's a record of everything. Of course, it's always best that the person asking the shaila identify themselves, regardless of whether they're using the phone channel or they're using the text message or email channel. If the Rav knows who he's talking to, this could often have bearing in halacha. Similar to when a person goes to a doctor, you can Google an answer for a medical situation, or you can actually talk to your doctor who has your file and knows your particular standing and would be able to give you a much more tailor-made answer for your situation. Moving on to another question. This is a very interesting question, and as we have recently celebrated the 50,000th question that came into our website. So this was question number 50,000. This came from a Rav in Eretz Yisrael, I believe it was in Bnei Brak. And this is a question they were facing over there. I'm not sure if they were facing this question in Bnei Brak proper or in Eretz Yisrael in general. So as there are sirens, and people hear the siren, they have to go to a miklat, to a shelter, merchav mugan. So there was a shul, a minyan, they were in the middle of Shema. I think it was a minyan, not a person davening b'yichidus. It was a minyan. And they were in the middle of Shema, and there was a siren, and everybody ran down to the shelter. In the shelter, they couldn't have continued davening because there was a horrible smell over there, and you're not allowed to daven in a place with horrible smell. So they couldn't proceed with davening. They had to wait for a very long time until they were able to get out of the shelter, come back to the shul, and continue the Shema. And the question that was asked was, do they have to go back to the beginning of the Shema? Why would they have to go back to the beginning of the Shema? And so this question came from a Rav Talmud Chacham Mechaber Svarim, and this is actually an interesting question because it's different aspects of the Shaila. The halacha is that if someone waits in the middle of Shema, a person stops for the amount of time that it takes to finish the entire Shema, he has to go back to the beginning. That means if he delayed, he stopped because he was forced to stop, not if he decided just to stop. If it's makom oinus. But it gets a bit more complex than that, because the place can make a distinction between what type of oinus. Is there an oinus machmas listim? Robbers came and you had to stop the Shema, was dangerous, and you just couldn't continue saying Shema? Or oinus machmas sha'makim oy ha'adam ein eroi. The oinus was because the place was unsuitable, or the person became unsuitable. Person wasn't able to daven anymore because of his particular situation. He had to go to the bathroom or whatever it is, and he was not allowed to daven in such a state, or the place became unsuitable. Poskim say that when the place is not suitable, that's considered, or the person, that's considered a proper hefsek, such a hefsek that cuts you off from your davening, and you got to start back to the beginning if you waited the amount of time that it takes you to say the whole entire thing, shah kadei ligma neskula. But if it was because of oines acher k'moy listim, there was robbers that came, no, that's not considered a hefsek machmas oines, and according to halacha, you would not have to go back to the beginning. Asks the Rav the question, the reason they stopped saying Shema, the reason they stopped was because they went to the shelter. Once they came to the shelter, now there became a new situation, and that the shelter has a horrible smell. But the reason I'm in a place of a horrible smell, I could technically go somewhere else. The reason I'm here is only because of the sirens. So do we treat it as if it's a problem with the place, or we treat it as an external oinus? So first and foremost, there is an argument in general, if you're in a place which has a horrible smell and you could technically leave that place, maybe it's not even considered makom ein eroi. This is a chiddush of the Afika Meginim. It's a very difficult thing to accept. It goes against the simple Gemara, the simple case in the Gemara if a person is mevoyis hamatunafis in streets that are unclean streets where you're not allowed to say Shemana. Of course, if you're in unclean streets, you can walk very fast or not go there. Nobody asked you to go down that street. So the chiddush of the Afika Meginim that says that if you could go out of there, it means that's not called an oinus. That's very hard to accept. Well, in this case, certainly they can't get out of the shelter. They're now stuck in the shelter because of the siren, because of the missiles. It makes sense to say that we look at what's happening right now. Right now, it's a makom she'ein eroi, and therefore they have to go back to the beginning of Shema. There was a Rav in Eretz Yisrael that argued that no, and he based himself on a Bach and a Machzas HaShekel, and El Yirabah, and a Pri Megadim. The argument was, I'm not sure if the Pri Megadim, that the reason why when the person in the place is not suitable, he has to go back to the beginning because he's a pesheya. He's like a pesheya. Because you should have checked the place, you should have checked your situation before davening if you're capable of davening right now or not. But when there's an external oinus, it's not his fault. And therefore this Rav wanted to argue that when the person has to go to a shelter because of a siren, it's not his fault. He's not a pesheya, he's not negligent. And if it's like an external oinus, then they wouldn't have to go back to the beginning of Shema. This doesn't sound right to me and to many other Rabbanim I discussed this with. First of all, the whole argument that it's based on whether he was negligent or not is not the simple reading of the halacha. If you open the Aruch HaShulchan, he explains it's very simple. Is it the halacha that you're not allowed to daven, or there's an external factor? When the place or the person is not suitable, then that's the person and place not suitable means halachically you're forbidden from davening. That creates a proper hefsek. And therefore he has to go back to the beginning. When there's robbers, other external factors don't necessitate going back to the beginning. So that's the simple way of understanding it. Although this explanation is inferred from the Bach, the Magen Avraham and the Alter Rebbe do not quote this part, and it seems like they don't accept that's the argument. And if you'd accept this argument, then that would mean that it would change the entire halacha. If a person before davening checked themselves out, if they have to go to the bathroom, then the halacha would be different, which is a massive chiddush. Arguably, if a person is going to a shelter, maybe the shelter generally should be checked before. Very often people know they might come a siren. But either way, it seems like we don't look at the reason why he came there, at his current situation. Currently, you're in a place that is not suitable. The Bach doesn't even say he's a peshe. He says, k'moy peshe. It's not really negligent. Therefore, let me just say the simple bottom line halacha, if a person was in such a situation, should not happen. We shouldn't have any more sirens, but if such a situation would have occurred, then, and has occurred as we have heard, when they had to leave because of a siren, but now they're in a shelter where they're not allowed to daven, in a place where you're not allowed to daven, and because of that you're not continuing to daven, and it takes the amount of time you delayed and did not daven, did not continue the Shema, the amount of time kadei ligament is called to finish the entire Shema, each person according to their speed of Shema, chossid, you have to go back to the beginning of Shema. Talking about shelters and sirens, I got an interesting comment, a letter from a Talmid Chacham in Eretz Yisrael, Mechaber Svarim, and he quoted a Gemara Masechtas Brachos, but the Gemara says that he was arguing that maybe people shouldn't stop their davening when there's a siren. And the reason for his argument was the Gemara says there was a pious individual that was davening, and he was on the way, and a minister came and he gave him shalom, told him shalom aleichem. He didn't respond. He was on Shemoneh Esrei. The minister waited till he finished Shemoneh Esrei, and he told him off, and he says, in your Torah it says, the mitzvah of Pikuach Nefesh, you need to preserve your life. Why did you not respond when I told you shalom? Shalom, when I said hello to you, why did you not respond to me? And he told him, if I would cut your head off using a sword, would anybody be able to stop me? So the chossid told him, wait, let me explain to you. I'm going to appease you and explain to you. I want to explain my situation. If you would stand in front of a king, and a person would say shalom, would you respond to him? He says, of course not. And if you would respond to someone as you were standing in front of the king, what would they do to you? He said, they would cut my head off. He says, well, if you would be standing, the chossid said to him, the pious individual, if you would be standing in front of a king of flesh and blood that's alive today, and tomorrow he won't necessarily be alive, you wouldn't respond. I am standing in front of the King of Kings, who's chai v'kayim la'adolem alam, who lives forever. Of course I can't respond. And when that hegmain echad, when that minister heard us, he was appeased, and the nifter oiseh chossid lebeisa l'sham, and the chossid went back home peacefully. So clearly this minister gave musar to this chossid and told him, yeah, p'koach nefesh. But the chossid has a munah in Hashem. He wasn't scared. He understood that he's standing in front of Malchei Amlachim that's alive forever. So based on your emunah, you can rely on your emunah even in a place of sakana, and certainly with the shaila of the isur, this is the argument. And if a person who wants to be connected to Hashem can rely on his emunah and should not stop their davening, especially nowadays that we know that it's far-fetched chances that the missiles could be harmful. It's one of thousands and 10,000s. We see the special nisim and the shmira that Hashem gives to Klal Yisrael. Is this really correct that you should not stop your davening when there's a siren? And the answer is absolutely incorrect. And for many reasons. The whole argument is absolutely faulty. First of all, the poskim write about this particular Gemara that the reason why the chossid echad, the Magen Avraham writes this, why this particular pious individual was not not responding shalom to the minister, because he knew that he could talk to the minister afterward. Yada sheyuchel afais, he knew he was able to appease him. He knew this wasn't dangerous. Point number one. Point number two. The Sefer Mata Yehuda, one of the early Sephardic poskim, writes, actually no. Even if you know, you're not allowed to rely. You know for a fact you can talk to this minister and talk him out and he won't do any harm to you. You're not allowed to rely on that. He says that the reason he didn't respond was very simple. He didn't notice there was a minister there. He thought it's not a person. And in many other answers, he explains why you can't learn from this, chas v'shalom, to learn from this, that if you know that you can appease him, that he shouldn't stop Shemoneh Esrei. No, he disagrees. He should not learn from this story. And because of that, mentions the Mat Yehuda, the Rif, the Rosh, the Tur, Bis Yosef, do not bring this story in their Svarim or anything about the story. And whenever there's any chashash, sakana, any concern of danger, you must stop your Shemoneh Esrei. Another Sephardi Pesach called the Yukach No, so one early Pesachim, he says, to say that he didn't notice it was a minister, that's a doichik, that's not the normal way of understanding. He said the answer is very simple. This is a chossid echad. Chossid echad was a pious individual. He had miracles happening to him all the time. He was a malumad benisim. He knew Hashem imay. Hashem is with him. And therefore he has nothing to worry. He'll daven and he's there's no danger will ever happen to him. And that's the reason the Poskim don't bring the story. Because nobody has this level that they could say they're such a high level. There's no such people. The people that are like that are chad v'dara, one in a generation. So Poskim don't mention the story that people that are not suitable, that are not as pious as these individuals, shouldn't learn. Yeah, I could continue davening Shemoneh Esrei even when it's a dangerous situation. And that is not correct. Indeed, the Pri Chodesh writes in this section of Shulchan Aruch, where it talks about being interrupting in the middle of Shemoneh Esrei, and says, no, if there's a melech, a king that's coming and it's dangerous, you're supposed to stop Shemoneh Esrei unless you know for sure, based on your tzidkus, on your righteousness, and who knows that, then nothing will happen to you. The Kaf HaChaim also says you shouldn't learn from this chossid. So I wrote back to this particular Machabes Torah B'nai Yisrael. He's bringing a Gemara that everybody brings that you're not supposed to learn from this Gemara. The Sefer Zahav Sheva says that the Gemara is telling us a story that we shouldn't learn from this chossid. The Pele Yoyt says even a bigger chiddush. He brings from Svarim that when the Gemara says this chossid niftar lebeisei l'shalom, he went home peacefully. The word niftar means he passed away. He actually, interesting pshat, he was punished because he was violated the rule of Nishmart Moed Manafshe Seichem. Now, some people want to argue in general that the idea of stopping Shemoneh Esrei when there's a case of danger is only when there's body hazeka, only when there's for sure harm going to happen. That's not the mainstream halacha. The Tvur Shoy wants to argue this, and he brings a raya that the halacha is there's a difference if a snake is surrounded around the person's heel, then he should not stop Shemoneh Esrei. If it's a scorpion is more dangerous, then a scorpion is supposed to stop. So he says the difference is that a snake, it's not for sure it's going to cause harm. Well, that particular point is actually a very difficult point. Why is it that when a snake is surrounded around the person, you're not supposed to stop your Shemoneh Esrei? People, the Rishonim Mefarshim talk about this a lot, and they bring a bunch of different explanations. The Mukar Rechaim of the Munkac has a lengthy arichas on this point, why when a snake is surrounded, you not have to stop Shemoneh Esrei. First of all, the Chinuch writes that the snake is talking about a snake that you know for sure doesn't kill. So the whole argument falls. Some people say because once a snake is wrapped around the person and he's not doing anything and he doesn't bite, for sure he won't bite. Also, they say that most snakes don't bite. And if they do, it doesn't harm. The Mukar Chaim concludes, the whole discussion about the Nachash. There's many other answers why it says in the Gemara there are Nachash. It's talking about those kind of snakes that don't cause harm. But the Mukar Chaim concludes, it says absolutely clear that according to halacha, any suffix doubt of pikuach nefesh, for sure a person should stop Shemoneh Esrei. But even if we will argue that since most snakes don't kill, if that's whatever the case, that's what some Mefarshim say, then over there, it's not only that, first of all, most snakes don't bite. And if they don't bite, if they do, they don't kill, which is two roivs, two majorities. But even if we would say one roiv is enough, a snake is very different than missiles, like many, many poskim of our generation said. The snake is very different than a missile. A missile is be'etzim dangerous. Sometimes the Eibushter helps is a hatzolah min hatzad. The danger is right in front of us. The snake is not a dangerous thing. It's a snake that bites. The missile is actually considered a dangerous thing mitzad atzmai. Besides for the fact that this whole entire conversation with the snake is talking about to be mafsik b'dibur. Here we're not talking about a person stopping their Shemoneh Esrei and talking. Here we're talking about just moving from one place to another. Certainly, even if you would say a person is allowed to be stringent and not be mafsik, that's talking not to stop your Shemoneh Esrei, talk in the middle of your Shemoneh Esrei. But to go from one place to another because the place of sakana, there's a missile coming, there's a warning, absolutely that's what a person is supposed to be doing. And we'll mention just the Marsha writes about this chossid echad, that this chossid echad wasn't worried in the case of the minister that it will be a sakana. His implication is that he looked at this minister, it's not a king, it's just a minister. He's like the difference between a snake and a scorpion. So if there's clearly a situation where there's a potential suffix of sakana, then one has to stop the Shemoneh Esrei, and they should not continue davening Shemoneh Esrei, but they should rather go to the shelter immediately. Which brings me to another question on that same topic, that a question was asked. There's warnings that people get that there might be a siren coming soon. So when they get the warning because they start Shemoneh Esrei, if the siren will come, they'll leave in the middle of Shemoneh Esrei. If there's no siren, we'll continue Shemoneh Esrei. Or do we? No. You can't. Once you get a warning, you're not allowed to start your Shemoneh Esrei with the understanding that you will leave in the middle if there's a siren. The answer is very clearly, emphatically, that if a person got a warning that might become a siren very soon, they're not supposed to start Shemoneh Esrei over here. Rely on the fact they're going to stop afterwards and go somewhere else. It's like asking, is a person allowed to daven on the train tracks? They don't know if there's a train coming or not. If a train will come, I will stop my Shemoneh Esrei and go off the train track because it's dangerous. You're not allowed to put yourself in a position, I'm not talking about a state of sakana. I'm not putting from a dangerous point of view. I'm talking about, it's not dangerous because there's time. Let's say there's time. You get a warning, and then there's a siren. And from the siren, there's enough time to get to the shelter. That's not the concern. You're not allowed to daven Shemoneh Esrei in a place which your kavanah will be disturbed. There's dvarim, one is supposed to remove before davening all the dvarim, ha'chofzim, v'atordim kavanasi, all the things that disturb your kavanah, your concentration. If you got a siren, if you got a warning to start Shemoneh Esrei, and now, will there be a siren, will there not be a siren? Will there be a siren, will there not be a siren? So, based on the fact that if there is a siren, you have to leave, I'm talking in a place where there's concerns of missiles and all that, and it's dangerous, then you're not allowed to begin with start your Shemoneh Esrei. Go there right away. Moving on to a Pesach question, and there's some people that are gluten intolerant, or various levels of that, how intolerant they are to gluten. Now, the question was, can they use oat matzah? Is oat matzah an option? So I want to go through a few points. First of all, let's talk about in general for kashrus, nothing to do with Pesach. Oat flour is a kosher ingredient. It doesn't need a hechsher, as long as, not for Pesach, we're talking about in general for the whole year. As long as there's no kosher sensitive ingredients added, plain oat flour would never be a problem. You just have to make sure it's not infested. And those who are particular about chadash, about new grain, have to always check the date code to work out what the right date is. But there's no real inherent problem with oat flour. Now, in terms of matzah, that's a very serious issue. Many of the oat matzahs are treated with heat, and that's the only way they can store them. And that's a serious question if that's acceptable for Pesach. There are available oat matzahs that are not treated with heat, and if a person needs to have oat matzah, they should use those. Different hechsherim follow different standards, so you need to get from a reliable hechsher and find out that the oat matzahs are not treated with heat. Wheat matzah, of course, is always preferred. But if a person has no choice, they'll use oat matzah. Same with spelt matzah. It's a mitzvah and a mufcher prefer to use wheat, but if a person has to, they can. And the Gemara writes the custom is to eat wheat, but a person has to use spelt matzah. Generally, you're not supposed to not veer away from this custom. But if there's a necessity, it's very, very different. There was an argument that Minchas Yitzchak argued that we have lost our tradition. There are 5 types of grain, but we have lost our tradition. We only know how to make matzah out of wheat, because for the past hundreds of years we've been making out of wheat. And therefore we don't know how to make matzah properly out of spelt or oats in a way that it shouldn't become chametz. But even the Minchas Yitzchak, who argued so, later wrote in a letter that he obviously wasn't talking about a person that for health reasons can't have wheat matzah. They can't have wheat matzah. The next preference is spelt, and the next one after that is actually oat matzah. There are 2 issues over here. Issues about chametz, which was the Minchas Yitzchak's argument that we don't know how to do it properly, and the other issue in terms of the fulfilling the mitzvah of matzah. So at least for the first night of Pesach, or the first 2 nights of Pesach, at least for the first kazayis of matzah, which mekayim the mitzvah of matzah, there's a preference, mitzvah namufcha, to eat dafka wheat. There's an argument over there that oats might not even be one of the 5 types of grain, but I'm not even going to discuss that argument, because as it goes against our Rishonim and our Paiskim, that all we have a Mesoda tradition that Shibboleth Shul refers to oats and not to another type, although there are many professors that for botanical reasons they argue that oats is not one of the 5 types of grain. That's not the accepted tradition amongst Klal Yisrael. The question is, someone who does not have oat or spelt matzah, all they have is wheat matzah, or they have a problem, they can't have oat matzah either. Oat matzah is no good for them also. Or they want to be extremely machmer, whatever it is, all that's left is now with the wheat matzah, and that's their only choice. They don't have anything else, whatever the situation is. And we often tell them, eat only one. Listen, the bare minimum, what's the bare minimum? The mitzvah, min haTorah, the only mitzvah of eating that we have nowadays, min haTorah, is the mitzvah of kazayis matzah. They eat one kazayis of matzah. But if they're eating only one kazayis of matzah, it's very important to understand, not the eating a kazayis of some people will eat the oats and the spells, but for the mitzvah of matzah, for the first kazayis, they'll eat wheat. No, I'm talking about some doesn't have oats. That's not an option. So he's only going to eat one kazayis and that's it. If you only eat one kazayis, that follows the halacha and Shulchan Aruch that if a person doesn't have matzah shmura, doesn't have matzah that's protected from chametz, he has matzah which is kosher, but it's not shmura l'shem mitzvahs matzah, he only has a kazayis. So the halacha is that this person eats the matzah at the end of the meal. He starts off with mutter. And at the end of the meal, he eats the matzah shmura. He makes a bracha on that matzah. Let me make it more clear, because there's two different scenarios. This scenario we have two different types of matzah, shmura and not shmura. Let me talk about the more simple example where a sick person who could only eat one kazayis, or he only has one kazayis. Says the Magen Avraham, don't eat the kazayis of matzah in the beginning of the meal like everybody else does. You eat whatever you want first. At the end of the meal, you'll wash and eat your kazayis matzah. That kazayis matzah will work for matzah and for afikomen. So this person makes kiddush first. After kiddush, kaddish, he needs to have kiddush makom suda. So the Magen Avraham says, have kneidlach. We don't need kneidlach on Pesach. We don't have any mezainis foods. So what is he going to have? Kiddush makom suda. He can have another cup of wine. Or alternatively, in the person's a desperate situation, you can rely on the opinions that having just one full revius. Normally for kiddush you don't have to have a full revius. By the Seder we are machmer if we can. But in this case for sure he has to have a full revius. There are those that say you need to have the mitzvah of kiddush plus another revius. For the kiddush you don't need the full one. But in this case, if a person has desperate, he can rely on one full revius, and that will be his kiddush makom suda. And then eat whatever you want, eat your meal, and leave your matzah to the very end of the meal. You'll wash. At the end of the meal, that's when you'll wash. So I do want to point out, if somebody is doing that, then they're washing only for one kazayis. They can't eat much more. When you wash for only a kazayis, you don't make the bracha on until sedayim unless you're eating a kabeah. That's relevant for the whole Pesach. For that matter, for people that are not eating enough. People go into the measurements, how much you have to eat for maitzi matzah. The question is, every time you wash, you need to eat a full kabeah. So if you're not eating kabeah, you don't make a bracha until sedayim. If you're going to be eating fish and flesh and all those things, you make a bracha. Normally, you don't make a bracha by the Seder on anything during your Shulchan Aruch. But this person's Shulchan Aruch was before he washed. When he makes in the beginning of the meal, he'll make a bracha on karpas, he'll make ha'adama, and that will cover his mutter, like we do, and that will also cover all the vegetables of his meal. He has to make a bracha on all the food except on the soup, because the soup is a liquid, and liquid is covered, all liquids are covered by wine, they're secondary to wine. But you make a shakal on meat, on the egg they eat for Shulchan Aruch. And before he eats his matzah, he will make a bracha achroina, before he washes for matzah, bracha achroina on his entire meal that he ate before. If he didn't make a bracha achroina, he has benching, only after the fact benching will cover it. But before benching, he'll have to make a bracha achroina. Even if you washed and ate matzah, make a bracha achroina because you still need to make a bracha achroina for the food before the meal. Another question that we got was about kashering. Can you use water that was heated on an induction stove to kasher items, or do you need to heat it dafka with fire? So it really depends. The simple answer is, if the fork, spoon, knife, whatever became treif, or became chametzdig, not via an induction stove, not in something that was heated via an induction stove, there is a chumah that says that for that, you shouldn't kasher using water that was heated in an induction stove. Let me explain. There's a discussion in the Gemara and in the Rishonim about using Chamet Tveri, the hot waters of the Tveri River. And the question is, why kashering wouldn't work there? In our Shulchan Aruch, it actually says that the reason is a problem to kasher because they're not tulda sa'ur, they're not created by fire. And that creates a whole shayla about electric in general. And about a microwave. But one thing that's clear in this halacha, that even if you're going to be machmer with the chametz verdi, even with chametz verdi, it says that if it absorbed treif or chametz via was the chametz verdi, then you're allowed to kasher via the chametz verdi. The Kivega says furthermore, that's not even a chiddush. Obviously, if it came treif to speak a kasher that way, the chiddush is, don't say that I have to dafka use chametz verdi. No, you can use any type of hot water. So if it became treif through a chametzik through an induction oven process, you could kasher through water heated in an induction oven. The question is if it came through something else, and that's a chumrah, although strictly speaking that really shouldn't be an issue whatsoever. I'll mention just one more final question. Someone was eating by a friend, he was invited out. He was started to bench and he said the word baruch, and his friend said, "No, wait, we still have, I want to serve more." So the halacha is if you gomer belibik, once a person decided doesn't want to eat anymore, that means the meal is over. You had a hes chadas. But we say that if you eat by other people, you never take your mind off because you rely on the tak of the balabais, on the table of the balabas. I'm a guest by him, I rely on him. But if a person washed already for my achronim, if a person already then his mind is off. What if you just said the word baruch? The answer clearly is once you said the word baruch, that's it. That your meal is over. And if you want to eat something now, you would have to make a new bracha on that. The reason why there's a question, this question came from a Mechabes farm, actually on Hilchos Birchas Hanenin, is because one of the points why not al yada when a person washes for mayim achreim, that's much more hes chadas, is because he did an action. Well, in this case, the guy didn't know an action. He just dibur. He just said the word baruch. But in this word is not just like saying, let's go bench, havalam v'nivrich. This is much worse. Saying the word baruch means starting to bench. Starting to bench means when a person is relying on the balabais, that means I nullified my mind. I in my mind decided to stop eating, so now I've nullified my mind to the mind of the balabais. But if I'm not part of the balabais, I removed myself completely, and I said the word baruch, that means it has nothing to do with my. I did not nullify myself to the balabais. So when you're relying on the table of balabas, so that means it's in a case where you took your mind off the food. Had I known the balabas would bring more food, I wouldn't take my mind off. But when you said the word baruch, has nothing to do with food. That means the meal is over. You removed yourself completely. So even if you just say the one word baruch, your meal is over, and you can't continue eating unless you make a new bracha. Achag kash v'sameach to all our listeners.
Join the global halacha learning revolution of the Laman Yilmadu Institute and bring increased brachos into your home. For details about the various learning programs, visit our website, lamanyilmadu.com. That's LEMAANYILMEDU.com.